Hi, Sandy.
Hi, Esther.
It's so good to see you. Really looking forward to having this conversation with you today. We, of course, know each other through the Asian Pacific American Women Lawyers Alliance. So I'm excited to have this talk and share some knowledge. So, do you want to start by introducing yourself?
Sure. So my name is Sandy Yu. I am currently a staff attorney with the Department of Social Services. Prior to working at the Department of Social Services, I was working at a private immigration law firm doing mostly removal defense. And prior to that, I spent 2 years working at a legal aid organization.
Great. And I know we're going to get more into all of your community service and everything that you've done as this talk progresses. For me, hi everyone, my name is Esther Rowe. I am currently a senior appellate attorney at the California Court of Appeal. Before that, I was a litigation partner at Morgan Lewis and Bockius. Again, Sandy and I know each other through our work with APALA. I currently co-chair the Civic Engagement Committee for APALA, and I also serve on the California Civility Task Force, which is a statewide task force to address issues of civility in the legal profession. So we wanted to jump right in and start talking about how bar associations have been an important part of our career and our progression in the profession. Sandy and I know each other through APALA, and she is the immediate past president of APALA. So, Sandy, can you talk a bit about why bar associations like APALA are important and why you've been such a leader in the organization?
So I think bar associations like APALA are important to the legal profession because it creates a space for attorneys who share similar interests or come from similar backgrounds to come together and support each other. And at the same time, be a voice for, our community. And what I really love and was driven by APALA was its mission statement, in which we promote inclusion, empowerment, and advancement of API women in the legal profession. And personally, as a first generation attorney, I did not know any attorney until after college. And I attended my first APALA event in 2011 as a law student. And I was just I felt so welcome by the board members, by the attorneys at the event. And being part of APALA really have given me mentorship, guidance, and a community where I can turn to. And it was really particularly important to me because not only has APALA has celebrated me when I have accomplished many things, but it has also provided me support when I when I didn't pass the bar exam the first time. When I didn't pass the bar exam the first time, I was devastated. And I turned to one of APALA's board members, Mia Yamamoto, who, sat me down, told me I can do this. And she provided me with resources such as the Takasugi bar support program, and really helped me pass the second time around. And I am forever grateful of guidance from Mia and other APALA board members.
That's great. I mean, I feel like the kind of support that you're talking about is so incredibly important for anyone who wants to thrive in the legal profession, because it can be a difficult profession and the work can be difficult. It can be taxing. And I think that if you have a group of friends that you both work with on behalf of the community, but who are also there to be your supporters and your champions, I just feel like it's an invaluable resource. One of the things that I really admire about you is the fact that as a relatively young attorney, you have already been the president of APALA, which I think is really amazing and so admirable. why did you feel like you wanted to take that sort of leadership position in the organization?
After being on the board of Apollo for the last few years, I decided to step up and take on a leadership role for twofold reasons. First, to give back to Apollo. Like I mentioned, it has given me a lot in terms of mentorship, guidance, and connections to other attorneys. And secondly, to support my other fellow Apollo sister who have also decided to take on leadership roles.
Right. Yeah, I think it's really incredible because you graduated from UCLA Law School. What year did you graduate?
I graduated in 2015.
Yeah, 2015. So I just think that's really amazing that you've been a part of Apollo since law school, and just sort of engaging with the bar organizations really early on, I guess technically even before your career started. And then to kind of come full circle and lead the organization through a pandemic, I think that is very, very admirable. So, and I know I appreciate you stepping up for sure to lead the organization. So, um, let's see, where should we go next?
Um, Did you want to talk about your career transition? I understand that you recently went through a career transition, and like you mentioned in your beginning, you are now an attorney with the Court of Appeals. And
Right.
so, what made you decide to make that decision?
Yeah. So, when I kind of think back, I also graduated from UCLA Law School in 2007. So I've been practicing for 15 years. Um, and I feel like in those 15 years, I've made four career transitions. The first one was, just straight out of law school, ending up and going to work at a law firm. And I feel like that wasn't really a decision. I didn't really have that many options, let's just say. And so, but I did have an offer to go work at a firm with folks that I really liked. And so that worked out for me. And so I ended up going there. And then at the start of my third year as a lawyer, I decided to leave the firm and go do an Equal Justice Works AmeriCorps fellowship with Asian Americans Advancing Justice. It used to be called something else, but Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Los Angeles. And it was a 1-year fellowship. And that was in 2009. And, I sought a lot of counsel and advice from friends and colleagues just to figure out whether or not that was the right move for me, whether or not it was what I wanted to go do. And I did get some advice from folks, and I think it was very well-meaning, but kind of some concern that the economy wasn't doing very well. It was very difficult to get a job at a law firm. And so if I left to go do public interest work, going back to, big law may not be an option. And so, I weighed that, and then I weighed the opportunity. And for me, I just felt like it was an opportunity for me to work with the Korean American community. And it was something that I really wanted to do. And it was important to me. And so I felt like I had to go and see for myself, whether or not that was the career path that I wanted to have as a lawyer. So I ended up doing that for a year, and it was direct services work. And I actually realized after that year that I felt like I did not want to do direct services as a career. I have so much respect for people who do direct services because it is incredibly emotionally, like sometimes for me, it was kind of overwhelming, right? Like to have to be basically the person in between this person losing their home or not felt it was a huge burden, and I just found it very overwhelming. And I kind of felt like, well, I think I'd want to do something along the lines of maybe impact litigation, but I don't think I want to do direct services. But at the time, there wasn't an opening to do impact litigation at the organization. So I thought to myself, okay, well, what am I going to do next? And I actually decided to go back to big law, which is a bit unusual because usually when people, once they leave, they don't go back. But for me, I realized, oh, I actually, enjoy being in that environment and doing that work. And I think I could do it for a while. And so I ended up going back to, this was not going back to, but going back to big law, but going to Morgan Lewis in San Francisco. So I started as a fourth year associate, and then was there for about 9 years, became a litigation partner. And then after that happened, in my 12th year of practice, I decided that I wanted to go in a different direction. And I think for me, it wasn't, I had been thinking about what it is that I wanted to be doing and how I wanted to be spending my time. And so when the opportunity at the court came up, I felt like this was a position and a job that felt aligned with my values and my priorities and what I wanted to be doing, in terms of legal practice. So I decided to do it, which I think to some people, it may have been a bit confusing, or maybe people didn't understand, why I would make that transition. Or, some people have asked me, why work so hard at something and achieve something and then leave? And I think this is kind of what I've learned through all of these transitions and choices that I've made in terms of my legal career. But I realize I am the kind of person who needs to do something in order to know for myself whether or not it is what I want to do. And so I am kind of the proof is in the pudding kind of person. And I need to make the pudding in order for me to find out, is this what I want to be doing? Yes or no. So I think for me, that's part of my personality is I need to just go do it to figure my path out. I think the other thing that I learned through these transitions is that, life in general is about making decisions, right? We have to make decisions in life. We have to carve a path. And sometimes it is easy to get onto one train, so to speak, and then just ride that train to the end, right? You're on the track, you just keep riding that train. And that's completely fine. And there are still, I think there's a lot more movement in the legal profession today than there was, like 30 years ago or longer, where, people joined one firm or one company and had their entire careers, at that one place. So I do think that people move around a lot more today. But for me, I don't really fear making a decision because I feel like life is about making decisions, and you do have to close some doors in order to walk through others. And the thing is you could make one decision and feel like, oh wait, that wasn't right, like that's not what I thought I wanted to go do this, but I was mistaken, but now I realize, okay, that's not what I want to do. And I feel like that's kind of what happened to me in my third year, right? When I went to go work for the nonprofit, I thought, oh, this is what I want to be doing. I truly, in my heart, like 100% believe that that's what I wanted to do. And then to realize that it wasn't, was a real gift to me, right? Because then I could spend the next 10 years like doing the work I was doing, knowing that, this is the space that I wanted to be in. So, if you don't like a decision, you can always make another decision, right? Like I feel like you can change the course of your life as you wish it. And there are obviously constraints to decision making, constraints, whether they're financial or familial or otherwise, but I do think that, I did learn that you can make a decision, you can go down one path, and if it turns out not to be the right path, you can go on another path. And sometimes it takes patience, right, to get to your kind of eventual endpoint. But I feel like I have hope that everyone will kind of get to where they're supposed to be.
That's a great lesson. I feel like you are right. You have to kind of test it out and figure out what you like and what you don't like. And once you figure that out, you can really go through that direction of what you like.
Right, right.
Right. And so do you mind sharing what values did you realize that you had to kind of put forth in terms of making that transition or that next step?
Yeah, I mean, so for me, one of the things that I've thought about since leaving the law firm is the law firm, in some sense, was kind of all consuming. It was obviously a lot of work and it was a lot of hours. And I think I just got to a point in my life where I felt like that was not how I wanted to spend my time. And I love law. I love learning. I love learning about new things, it's just things I've never heard, no, nothing that something that I didn't know about. And every day I feel like at this job that I have now at the court, I feel like I learn something every single day. And being at the court, I work on not just civil, which is what I did before, but also criminal and dependency, probate. And so I get to really get a sense of different areas of the law, different issues, constitutional issues. And I think it's really fascinating and I really love it. And another thing that I've been thinking about since leaving is I think for lawyers, we place a great emphasis on our jobs. And in some sense, rightly so, because we worked so hard to get our law degrees. It was both expensive and time consuming
Mhm.
for us to do that. And so I think being a lawyer, then being a very kind of core part of your identity is natural for that to happen. But I think for me, I've thought about this idea that, our work doesn't necessarily have to define us. And, as important as work is, and I do like currently, I love my work. I love what I do. But I also feel like my identity is not just about the fact that I'm a lawyer or that I'm a lawyer for the court. I feel like I have so many more interests like outside of work and just topics, random topics, etc., that I just want to explore and learn about. So I feel like for me, in terms of both making this transition and thinking about my values and like my priorities, really, I just decided, ultimately for me, the decision made sense. And, I'm 2.5 years in now and I love it. I think it's really fantastic. And so I feel like I did make the right choice for myself. So,
That's
yeah.
great. And I know that sometimes, you know, us attorneys, we like to talk about, work-life balance, and trying to find the next job that has maybe more work-life balance. And so how has your, recent move leaving private practice to becoming attorney for the Court of Appeal affected the way you view on work-life balance?
Yeah. So I think work life balance is a tricky topic because work life balance is going to mean different things to different people. And so it's not really an objective standard. It's really what works for you as an individual in light of your job, in light of your obligations, whether they're, family, social, community, etc. And so I think for me, making this transition, I feel like what I love about this job is that I feel very engaged with the work that I'm doing. But I also find that I'm allowed to step away from the work without feeling like it's hanging over me at all times. And I do think that that was kind of a sense that I had when I was at the law firm. I felt like there was always something more to do, or there, it always seemed like there was an emergency. And so it was hard to schedule, on my own schedule, the things that I wanted to do. And so I think for me, it was, just being in a job now that allows me to be like very engaged with my job, but at the same time allowing me to, read and write and, see friends, see family. Those are the types of things that are important to me. Like kind of developing this rich inner life is very important to me. And so I feel like I've been able to do that with this job, which I'm really thankful for. So, um, yeah. So anyway,
Yeah, no, it sounds like your recent transition really aligned with, this value of, having a rich inner life. And so that's really wonderful to
yeah,
hear.
thank you. Um, so I know one of the topics that we wanted to hit on was dealing with bias in the profession. And I feel like that is something that we talk about at Apollo, with our, with our fellow Apollo members and board members. But I wanted to just start by asking you in terms of bias, have you, in your years of practice, have you experienced bias? And if so, like kind of what kind of bias, what contexts?
Um, so after starting to practice, I have experienced different kind of bias, from gender bias to race bias. Has a relatively younger attorney,
Mhm.
woman attorney. Sometimes when I have opposing counsel who are male, they sometimes will belittle my knowledge, or talk over me when I'm talking. And in some ways it does affect you, and it makes you feel like, do my words or do I matter? um, and in terms of racial bias, I have shared with some of my Apollo friends that when I first started practicing, I was sitting in a courtroom with my client, and someone went up to me and asked if I was the court interpreter, based
Mm,
on what I look like. And so it kind of, make me feel like maybe I didn't look like someone who belonged in the profession. And so when I deal with these bias, I think it's really important to have, support system to talk through your feelings. I'm really lucky to have my Apollo friends who, can validate what I felt and
mhm,
can let me know that, what happened, you know, were not right. And also have supportive colleagues and supervisor to kind of talk through the issues. And then once you're comfortable with it, it's also important to be able to address it, whether that's telling opposing counsel to cut it off out, or, being able to really address it through another forum.
mhm. I mean, I don't think that there is an attorney of color, a woman attorney, who hasn't experienced some form of bias in the profession. Um, I know that we've, hosted or co-hosted numerous programs about the issue of bias. And, every time it's always a just an ongoing number of stories that women attorneys, women of color attorneys have to tell about, not looking like a lawyer, being misidentified in that way, or, being misidentified as a judicial officer, which we've heard from, the judges that we've spoken with. And so it definitely feels like it continues in the profession. Um, and I mean, I've definitely had those experiences as well, where it's that kind of encounter with, it's like an interpersonal encounter with bias, and having to deal with that, whether it's opposing counsel or a colleague. Um, I feel like, there's like the other kinds of bias that I think we still have in the profession is the idea of women taking on the kind of invisible work, like we call it, that tends to be, more administrative or the organizing aspect of doing something. So, if you're in a meeting and someone, it's like, oh, can someone take notes? It'll either be assigned to, or perhaps, a woman attorney will volunteer as the person to take the notes. Or even working on, volunteer committees, it always seems to be the women who are sending out the dial-in, prompting the group to get together. And have you also seen that kind of in either in your work or in your volunteer activities?
I have, and I think you point out something interesting that, it does tend to be women. And so do you have any suggestion on what we as women can do?
I mean, I think sometimes we just have to not volunteer and deal with the uncomfortableness that may be with a question of effort hanging in the balance. So, if it's you have some kind of a work get together and there's a question of, oh, who can, stay and clean up or something, don't be the only one to be that person who is there cleaning up. And I think sometimes we just have to not do it. But in some sense, I feel like it's in my nature to do it in the sense that I just want to get it done. So I care more about it getting done usually than who's actually doing it. But I will say that if I start to notice a pattern in a specific situation, then I do think that I'll change my behavior, because then it'll start to bother me, right? Like something seems off here. It shouldn't be like this. So I guess it's like the opposite of leaning in, it's like leaning
Yeah.
out. Just in that context.
Yeah. And I think another thing I try to do is I try to volunteer someone else to do it. So I would be like, last time I was the one who created the meeting link. Why don't, Bob, can you do it for the next meeting? So
Right.
that, the work is passed along.
Right. Yeah. And I think another thing for attorneys who are in positions of either management or supervising, I think something that can be useful also is to acknowledge the work that's being done. And so if someone volunteered to do the notes, to acknowledge that person at the next meeting or thank that person for doing that. Because I think part of the problem is that a lot of this work goes unrecognized. And, it would help at least a bit, I think, to at least recognize the work that's being done. And so, the other thing that I was thinking about was in terms of bias and sort of dealing with bias in the profession. I think another thing that happens, and it has happened to me, is this idea of performing at work, in the sense of having to negotiate negative stereotypes that people may have about me. And I feel like, Asian American women, there are, stereotypes on both ends. There's the kind of more aggressive woman, and then on the other end, there's the very quiet woman. And so trying to negotiate between those two things and to kind of constantly be thinking about those things when you enter a room, or you're entering some space and you have to, just like I guess you're being sized up, you also have to figure out, oh, okay, I don't, it's like having to almost combat the stereotype before it happens. So it's like a preemptive strike to try to deal with it. And I think that bias is involved with us having to kind of do that sort of mental gymnastics in our minds about how we present ourselves in our workspaces. What do you think?
Yeah, I can relate to that. I think oftentimes because of what I look and there is a stereotype, of, Asian woman being quiet. I sometimes see myself juggle between that stereotype and how I want other people to not perceive me as that stereotype. And so I would, do some internal talking with myself of like, I need to speak up. I need to make sure, I have spoken up at the meeting. So, X person can notice my name, can notice my contribution to this meeting.
Right.
And so I do sometimes feel like that juggle. Also, I think sometimes in courtroom, people see me as an Asian person, and so they perceive me as quiet in addition and also nice. And so sometimes when I do my cross, people are very surprised that, I can be the opposite of nice.
Right.
and so yeah, so I totally understand what you mean by that gymnastic of juggling between your inner thoughts of the typical stereotype and what you want to kind of overcome.
Right. Right. And I think in terms of sort of the things that go on in your head, and you mentioned this earlier, when you do encounter bias, there also is that process of processing what happens to you. And and that also takes time and energy, and it's this idea of like kind of almost a burden, like an additional burden that's borne by that I have definitely borne, and I think you have too. But this idea that we have to always kind of be just sort of thinking about or negotiating or processing, and that takes effort, effort that could be put towards work, for example, right? Or trying to
Mhm.
bill more hours or get your work done. And so I do think that that is also kind of this mental burden that still exists in our profession, for women of color, women attorneys. So something that we still, I think, as a profession, haven't quite figured out how to deal with.
Yeah.
So, okay. So let's see. All right. So I think this is actually a good segue into our next topic, which is just kind of observations, right, that we have made in our careers so far in terms of either, obstacles that we see women attorneys of color face, um, or just observations about kind of where we think the profession is in terms of issues relating to attorneys of color and women attorneys. But I mean, I'm happy to start and then yeah, definitely
Yes.
chime in. Yeah.
Sounds good. So do you mind sharing, when did you graduate from law school?
2007.
And so at that time, did you notice any obstacles that were being faced by women attorneys and attorneys of color?
Yes, I did for sure. And I think it's a lot of what we just discussed. The idea of, being in spaces where people thought maybe they were surprised to find us in, or they did not think that we should be in. Um, and just finding ourselves, just trying to operate in this, space that it tends to be male dominated, and just trying to figure out what it is that how we can negotiate, working in that kind of environment. And I feel, in some sense, I feel lucky because I was an Asian American studies major in college, and in law school, I specialized in critical race theory. And so, in some ways, I felt like well equipped to understand conceptually what was going on and why certain things were happening, and being able to explain that to myself and to understand what, the things that I saw and the observations that I made and the experiences that I had. So, and it's It's interesting because in the past 15 years, I feel like in some sense it has gotten better, but I've continued to have, experiences of bias. And when I talk to younger attorneys, they have had similar experiences. So it makes me think that perhaps as a profession, we still haven't really grappled with how to address this issue. Um, yeah.
And so, what areas of improvements do you see us as a legal profession need to make?
Um, so I think one area is, there whenever we talk about DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, I feel like really in the past 15 years, the focus has very heavily been on implicit bias as kind of the problem. And I think, and there have been so many implicit bias trainings, and a lot of DEI trainings revolve around addressing implicit bias. I think addressing implicit bias is really important. But I also think that it is only part of the solution. And it would be great, I think, for the profession if we could also turn to thinking about how we can make structural changes to the profession in order to make it more inclusive and to make it more welcoming to, folks who want to join the profession. Um, so that's sort of this, I think we need to sort of get out of the implicit bias bubble a bit and think more creatively and to think bigger about what it is that we can do to try to, kind of change the infrastructure, right? Change the bones of the profession in some sense to make it more conducive, right? For others to have an experience, like an equitable experience. Um, so that's definitely one thing that I think we could, as a profession, try to also pay more attention to. So what about you? So you graduated 2015, so you've been practicing 7 years. But what about in the past 7 years? What kind of observations have you made?
I think one of the main observations that I have seen um, is that when I was in law school, I think there were like maybe 50% male students and 50% female students. However, now that I am in the legal profession, I've noticed that there are fewer women in leadership roles in government, in nonprofits, and even in firms. And
Mhm.
so I would love to see more opportunities to encourage women and also to open that space for women, especially women of color, to climb up that ladder.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, I think just based on my experience at a firm, I think that that's right in terms of there still not being women, and particularly women of color, in leadership positions or like meaningful substantive positions in firms. So just as a general matter, and so I do think that that's an area where we need to try to improve. I also, it's just thinking about firms. I also think that there is, an issue around sort of the performative nature of some of what firms do in terms of their DEI work. And I think that, there's a gap. For me, there was always a gap between, the sort of DEI is a pillar of, the firm, which I hear almost every firm say, right, as it's a pillar of, it's one of our cores, it's very important to us. Um, but there always, seems like there's a gap between sort of the stated, values versus sort of what's actually happening on the ground, and what those experiences are like. And it's hard. It's a difficult question, I think, to try to answer, because I know that there are also tremendous efforts being made to try to address, DEI and especially like inclusiveness, right? In the law firm setting and other organizations and other settings as well. Um, but I do think that that's something that, firms and corporations should sort of be thinking about, right? Is, how are our efforts being perceived? And if they are being perceived as performative, what can we do to try to remedy that? And something that I've thought about for a while is this idea, when we talk about structural change or how can we bring about structural change, at least within the law firm context, the billable hour is sort of still, notwithstanding these new fee structures and things like that, the billable hour is still sort of an important metric in the law firm setting. And so, I wonder whether we can move kind of towards what's happened to pro bono work. So at a lot of firms now, pro bono work is considered billable work. And at some firms, it's capped, at other firms, it's uncapped. But I think the fact that pro bono work is allowed to be billable work is really putting, your money where your mouth is, in the sense that you're telling everyone this work is on par with the work that we do for our paying clients. And so we encourage you to do it. We think you should be doing it. And it's an important part of the profession. And I wonder whether or not, people who spend time doing DEI work for their firms, whether they can also count those hours as billable hours, because I think that would really send a message to folks that we really think that DEI is an incredibly important issue at our firm and in the profession. And so if you spend your time with DEI efforts, then that is something that we want to count towards your, billable time, and how that might work out, and whether that could be a structural change that really, gives it some teeth, right? Really shows people that, yes, this is important to us. And in fact, it's so important to us, we put it on par with, the paid work that we do. So, when I think about structural changes, that's the kind of thing that I think about, right? How can we kind of change the bones to make it, in a shape that looks more like what we want to see?
That's a great idea. I would love to see that happen.
Yeah, and I don't. I mean, maybe it has. It's been a couple years, right, since I've been in that setting. But if it hasn't, it's something to consider, I think.
Think about, yeah, that's great. So to wrap things up, going on to our final topic, looking at your career and the transition that you have made, do you have any advice for attorneys who are just starting out on how to thrive in this legal profession and also in life?
Yeah, I think the most important thing that has guided me is it's a saying, which is, bloom where you're planted. I feel very strongly about that statement, in the sense that, sometimes you might find yourself starting out your career not doing exactly what you want to be doing, or, not doing what you thought you would be doing after law school. And that can be discouraging. But I always encourage everyone, including myself, whatever situation I find myself in, I try to really just make the most out of my situation, and to learn everything that I can, and to meet as many people as I can, and to develop my skill set and really feel right, like engaged with the work. Because I definitely will say that when I'm engaged with the work, the time goes by much faster. I'm happier. I feel more satisfied. So I feel like, no matter where you find yourself, I think it's important to, just make your best effort. It's really for you, it will ultimately inure to your employer, of course, but really it's for your own benefit and your own well-being. Yeah. Sandy, what do you think?
No, I completely agree with you. Um, when I first started out, um, I wasn't really liking the work I was doing.
Mhm.
But, I met incredible supervisor who taught me a lot. I learned how to do my first restraining order hearings. I learned how to do, cross and direct from an amazing supervisor that I wouldn't have otherwise gotten to meet. And so really take the most out of it and use that knowledge and lesson onto your next job. And hopefully the next job will, be the one that you like a little bit more, and really learn from each experience, what you like, what you don't like. So hopefully you'll
Mhm.
land a job that you feel very satisfied with.
Right.
And then I think another advice that I also like to give to my mentees is to join bar association if they
Yeah.
can and meet mentors and really talk to as many people as you can to get advice from. You never know who you're going to meet. And sometimes that person can really connect you to a person who's doing a job that you want to do someday, or can share some advice to you, and make mentors in your job and also outside of your job, because I think that's really important to have. I have a small group of coworkers who I like chat every day, and get advice on how to approach a case or just about life.
Mhm.
And I also have, my mentors and friends from Apollo who also, provide that support and mentorship.
Yeah. One of the things that you and I talked about was how mentors can really be both up and down. I mean, usually we think about mentors as being people who are more senior than us, who practice for longer. But I certainly feel that I have mentors who are, women who are younger than me, who've practiced, fewer years than I have. But I don't think it's really about, the number of years practice or age or anything like that. I think a mentor is a trusted, it ultimately becomes a trusted friend is what a mentor I think becomes. And that person can be, someone who is younger than you. There's like nothing wrong with that, right? Like that's totally fine. But going back to kind of what we first started when we started this conversation is, I think the other thing for really thriving in life is just the importance of friendships. And for me, it's in particular like my girlfriends, women friendships, I think are so incredibly valuable. When I think about in my life today, sort of, the five closest women that are in my life, one is from college, two are from law school, and two are from two different jobs that I've had. And I don't know really what I would do without my girlfriends, without my friendships. And I feel like, the life can get very busy and the profession and your work can become very, very busy. But, I always feel like try to make time to nurture your friendships because that's what's important in life, your friendships, your family, the things that are sort of personal to you are the things that I think are the most important at the end of the day. And so just keeping, those people around and close to you and connected, I think can go a long way for mental health, for getting through the tough times, getting advice. So I would definitely encourage that, for sure.
I agree. And I know in our legal profession, we often talk about mentors. And then I also feel like there's another terms that have been popping up more, called sponsor. And so what does sponsor mean to you versus mentors?
Yeah, so a sponsor to me is someone who is in a position of power, so to speak, meaning someone who is in the room when the decision is being made, someone who has access to, if you're in a law firm, kind of either high profile cases or the substantive work or what have you. And I think a sponsor is really someone who I think is in a position that can basically elevate your career to the next level. And I don't think a sponsor is necessarily becomes like a trusted friend, which is what I said, what I think that a mentor and ultimately becomes. Sometimes there may be a little bit more distance between like you and your sponsor, or it may be more of a work-based relationship. But I think that's completely fine, right? Because a lot of times you're in companies and organizations, et cetera, the person who has that power, maybe, yeah, that person, you don't have that much in common with that person. That person's not someone you would grab, a drink with or a coffee with or something. But, if that person expresses an interest in your career and you also demonstrate to that sponsor, your how, your hard work, everything that you're willing to contribute, I think those can be really, I think they're actually key to in terms of promotion and being successful. So I think it's important to have both in your life, but I do think they are kind of two different two different roles.
And how would a person find sponsors?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, I feel like they tend to be organic, meaning, you meet somebody, you start working with them, you have a good working relationship, and so you kind of do more work for them, you get to know each other, and you always sort of obviously make that effort to try to get to know your sponsor, or to really do a lot of like great work for that person. I think that it can be also a little bit more intentional. If there is someone at your organization that you are like, oh, that person really, I feel that's my role model. Like that person is practicing and living a life in the way that I would like to, have my life go. And so I think when something like, if you do see someone, obviously it would behoove you to really make that effort to reach out to that person and try to establish a relationship, especially if there's not an opportunity to work together, to otherwise try to establish a relationship and find some other way to connect to that person. But yeah, I mean, it is hard. I mean, I feel like the reason why a lot of people, and particularly women and attorneys of color, they leave law firms because they didn't find a sponsor, right? And so I do think that that happens. And again, that goes back to sort of the structural question of, how can structures be put into place to try to pave that road, to a sponsor for more women, for more attorneys of color. um, and I mean, during this discussion, we have been sort of, kind of calling, women attorneys and attorneys of color, but of course there are, folks like you and me, and we are, women attorneys of color. And so I definitely want to recognize the, intersectional aspect of our identities in these spaces. But yeah, so I think that's like another area where there's still, work to be done.
Agree. And I think from my experience, I have found sponsors through, my work with committees. So I know
Mhm.
sometimes at your job, you might have committees. And so there might be people there that can notice your work and can speak highly of your work if you perform well. Sometimes in my old job, my supervisor has been my sponsor when there are discussions being made. And so I do think it's really important to try to find sponsor if you can and really nurture that relationship.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so kind of related to this topic, um, what suggestions do you have for attorneys who are supervisors or in leadership positions?
Yeah, I mean, it's it's about effort. I think it's, to a certain extent, it's about making that effort to try to identify, folks who are promising, folks that you see potential in, and also just being there and being aware, and trying to see if someone is falling through the cracks, and if they're falling through the cracks, making that affirmative effort to try to, help them, right, in terms of getting them back on track or figuring out what the issues are, and making that extra, attention or effort in terms of, just making sure that people are kind of where they need to be. Um, I also think, we touched on this earlier, but I think another thing that is good to do is just this kind of awareness about how work is being distributed and what kind of work is being distributed to which people. And, being more deliberate about that, the spread of work and how that happens. I think that is something that consciously, people, managers and supervisors should be thinking about in their own practices and on their own teams. So I think that's definitely something that they can do. What do you think in terms of the kind of supervisor managerial role?
I think as supervisor, I think one suggestion is to really like promote the staff under you. So like recognizing your employees' work and contribution so that their name and their work are being recognized. And also, being mindful about the work that is being assigned to
Right.
who. I know that my previous supervisor was very mindful about the work that was being assigned and also making sure that the work that is being assigned is divided equally.
Right.
And so not all the complicated or highly publicized work goes to one person, that everyone is given the opportunity to do those kind of work. Are the two suggestions that I have.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are great suggestions. I mean, just like raising the consciousness, right, about being more intentional about your own teams and what's happening on your own teams, I think would, go quite far. So,
And going on to the next question, since we're both part of APALA and Bar Association, what can Bar Association do to empower women attorney and attorney of color?
I mean, I think that bar associations play such an important role in elevating the issues that impact women attorneys, that impact attorneys of color, and also just things that are happening in the community, right? So APALA, last year when there was a spike in anti-Asian violence, trying to address those issues. I mean, anti-Asian violence is not specific to the legal profession, but it's certainly something that, our communities were facing. And so I think just drawing attention to the issues that are happening in the community, if there is any legal solution, right, if we can participate in some way as lawyers, since that is our skill, that's our expertise, I think that's also something that bar associations can do. But I really think it's about sort of amplifying and elevating just the diverse voices, not just one person, not just a few people, but so many people have a lot of thoughts about things, right? And just making sure that people have an opportunity to share their insights, to share their experiences. And I feel like the bar associations do a really great job of trying to, amplify the voices through events, through, group discussions, et cetera. But I think it plays like a really important role in terms of empowering, women and attorneys of color. So, yeah, I mean, I feel like that is probably your experience with APALA, but you can speak for yourself.
Yeah, no, I was going to add that something that APALA has taught me and what I really admire about APALA is their ability to really amplify issues that are facing attorneys of color. So like the imposter syndrome and making me feel that I'm not alone and that there is, this community that, can validate my feeling, but also making sure that I have tools to feel that I am enough.
Right.
And I really appreciate that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so talking about Bar Association, something that I have noticed that you do very well is that you do a great job in bringing other women to the table, having them, voice their opinions in APALA's, civic engagement committee. And so how do you do that?
I just ask. I always try to invite people's thoughts. I read a lot. I probably read a couple hours a day, whether it's, periodicals or books or, I also listen to podcasts, but I am a very curious person. And I am also someone who's very aware that she does not know the answer to most things. And so I am always very curious about what is on other people's minds, what they're thinking, why they're thinking, what they're thinking. Will that influence what I'm thinking? Has someone thought about something that I haven't thought about? How does that change my frame for how I consider an issue? We all have different experiences, so we all come from different backgrounds and different perspectives. So I really value, like, I feel like the work that we do, for example, on the Civic Engagement Committee, we wouldn't really be able to do it without everyone, participating in terms of letting us know what they're thinking about, what issues are important to them right now in the community, in the profession, and really getting kind of a broad array of what people think is what we should be focusing our energy on. So I feel like it's really about just opening up space for people and creating an environment where they feel comfortable to share what they're thinking, even if what they're thinking is different from what I'm thinking. I actually want to hear the counter. I want to hear what someone else is thinking, particularly when it's different from my own, because I feel like that only helps me. Either be like, oh, maybe I've been misthinking that, or two, how do I counter what I've just been told? Like, if I'm still sticking by what I think, then, it helps me think about, oh, that's what is concerning to, someone who feels differently than me. I wonder how I could talk to that person about, why, I think that, what their concern is, like how it can be addressed or something. So, but yeah, I really think it's just about sort of opening up that space and making people feel comfortable and safe to speak their mind, right? To share their ideas and their thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see us apply that to, our workspace and seeing more people, opening that space for other, attorneys, especially women attorneys and attorney of color.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I feel like we all just need to kind of keep making that effort, right? It's ongoing. It's an ongoing
process,
situation. Yeah.
Great. Well, is there any other questions? Anything else we should cover?
No, I'm good. I think this has been, yeah, I've really enjoyed having this conversation with you. I mean, I always enjoy kind of speaking with you about all sorts of different things, and we've had a lot of conversations in the past. So this was nice to have this talk with you.
Likewise, and I felt like I learned a lot from you. And so thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much, for this opportunity.